Good evening, my friends. Wherever this voice finds you tonight, whether beneath the noise of New York, the quiet of Nairobi, or the red dust of Ouagadougou, listen closely, because what you're about to hear isn't just another headline from the global south. It is the pulse of something ancient, something the world tried to bury beneath silence and sand. For generations, the Sahel was called a wasteland, a corridor of despair where promises came to die, where soldiers marched in circles, where foreign powers spoke of stability while feeding the fire. They drew maps, they made speeches, they called it peace, but it was peace bought with permission. And Africa, once again, was told to wait. Wait for the aid. Wait for the experts. Wait for salvation that never came. But then, a morning broke that changed everything. A morning when the horizon did not bring new orders from Paris or Washington, but the sound of African engines warming beneath the desert wind. October 2025, a date the textbooks will write in quiet awe. From the sun-scorched plains of Tindiban, the impossible became inevitable. Three nations, once separated by suspicion and borders drawn by strangers, rose as one body. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. Different tongues, same heartbeat. Their flags no longer mattered. Their accents, their borders, their doubts, all dissolved beneath a single roar. We will defend our land by our own hands. This was no ordinary operation. It was rebellion against dependency, a declaration that sovereignty does not need permission. At its center stood a man forged by war and silence, General Ibrahim Traoré. To his enemies, a mystery. To his people, a promise. To history, a mirror of Africa's forgotten strength. That dawn, the desert was cold, near freezing. But above the dunes, silent drones hovered like patient hawks, scanning the darkness for movement. In Bamako and Ouagadougou, flickering command screens lit up with coordinates. A new intelligence network, designed not in Silicon Valley but by Sahelian engineers, connected every soldier, every drone, every eye. When the first data came through, it confirmed their fears. A massive buildup of fighters and fuel trucks. The terrorist army of Janim, preparing another assault on border towns. For years, they had slaughtered at will. This time, the hunters had become the hunted. At 04:13 a.m., Traore gave a single order, not shouted, not dramatic, but steady, measured, and final. We will not react. We will define the battlefield. Moments later, the desert sky cracked open. From Burkina Faso's northern batteries, the newly acquired SR-5 rocket systems roared alive. Orange and red streaks tore through the dawn, each missile guided not by foreign satellites, but by African drones. Witnesses in nearby villages said the earth itself trembled, a deep, rolling thunder that felt less like destruction and more like deliverance. The first wave shredded the convoys. Motorcycles twisted into molten steel, fuel depots ignited like suns. By noon, the fighters who had once haunted the Sahel were blind, isolated, running in circles beneath their own smoke. Then came the second wave, precision strikes from Mali's Air Force, laser-guided, disciplined, exact. Niger's ground units advanced through the dunes in perfect formation, their moves choreographed by real-time drone feeds. There was no chaos, no confusion, only rhythm. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a symphony, intelligence, mobility, unity. The three pillars of Traoré's doctrine made flesh in flame across the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, AES forces walked through silence, the kind of silence that follows revelation. Among the ruins, they found more than weapons. Maps, laptops, coded messages linking Janim to smuggling routes reaching Libya and Sudan. That data would save thousands of lives in the months to come. But the true miracle was not the intelligence recovered. It was the life preserved. For the first time in decades, a major Sahelian victory came with minimal losses. No mass graves, no unmarked coffins, just soldiers returning upright, their boots heavy with dust and dignity. As word spread, disbelief turned into something deeper, pride. In villages once too afraid to dream, people ran into the streets, waving torn flags and chanting names they'd never forget. AES. Africa defends itself. Radio stations replayed Traoré's message from the field. We do not fight for applause. We fight so our children can sleep. That sentence became an anthem, painted on walls, whispered in markets, etched into memory, because for the first time in living memory, the world saw what the textbooks never wrote, that unity is not a myth, and Africa's strength is not a story. It is a storm waiting for the right wind. And that wind began at Tindiban. By the evening of October 12, 2025, the smoke over Tindiban had thinned to a pale gray ribbon against the horizon. The desert, once littered with fear, now breathed with silence. But that silence did not last. Across the Sahel, from the marketplaces of Bamako to the riverbanks of Niamey, the echo of victory was beginning to move like thunder through a canyon. For 20 years, foreign generals had called this land ungovernable. They called its people incapable. They called its hope unsustainable. Yet in 48 hours, 3 nations under sanction had done what 2 decades of foreign intervention could not. They ended the terror that had haunted them. In Ouagadougou, people poured into the streets as if pulled by a single heartbeat. Men embraced strangers. Women lifted scarves toward the sky. Children beat drums made from oil cans, and the rhythm they played was not of mourning, it was of awakening. There were no fireworks, no government-organized parade, just the raw, unfiltered joy of a people realizing that they had saved themselves. Radio hosts could hardly speak through tears as they repeated the same phrase again and again. We did it without them. At dawn the next morning, General Ibrahim Traoré stood before the nation. No marble backdrop, no teleprompter, only dust on his uniform and the fatigue of a man who had not slept in 2 days. The Sahel has bled long enough, he said, his voice steady but heavy. Today we stop the bleeding with our own hands. This victory is not mine. It belongs to every mother who refused to surrender, every soldier who stood his ground, and every young African who still believes. We are enough. That was not rhetoric. It was revelation. Within hours, an image flooded the digital world. 3 AES soldiers, standing beneath a tattered Sahelian flag, their rifles slung, their eyes fixed on the rising sun. Captioned simply, Africa fights for Africa. The image spread across the continent faster than any broadcast ever could. In Conakry, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya addressed his troops. The Sahel has shown us the mirror of our own potential. In Accra, universities held emergency forums titled The Tindiban Model, African Solutions for African Problems. In Lomé, young artists painted murals of the AES tricolor wrapped around a roaring lion. Across Cameroon and Congo, the chant rose from crowds like a heartbeat made of thousands of voices. AES, AES. To outsiders, it was noise. To Africans, it was prophecy. But beneath the chants lay something deeper, reflection. What did this victory mean beyond the battlefield? Could it hold against the tides of politics, pressure, and propaganda soon to come? In barracks across Burkina Faso and Mali, officers replayed radio transmissions from the operation. Every second of coordination, every decision taken without foreign oversight, became a lesson. For young recruits, it was not just history. It was a manual for independence. And then came the moment that silenced every room. A group of widows from northern Burkina Faso, women who had lost their husbands in earlier wars, were invited to the capital. One of them, Mariam, held a faded photograph of her husband. She looked at the camera, tears carving lines in the dust on her face, and whispered, "He can rest now. The Sahel is not lost." That single sentence carried more power than any diplomatic statement. It was the sound of grief turning into grace, of history bending toward healing. But while the Sahel rejoiced, far across the Mediterranean, unease spread. In Paris, ministers demanded explanations. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to understand how a coalition once dismissed as disorganized militias had become one of the most effective fighting forces in modern Africa. Commentators argued on late-night television, was it luck? Was it Russian influence? Was it Chinese hardware? No one dared to accept the simplest answer, that Africa had done it alone. When asked whether the AES had received any external help, Traore smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, from our ancestors." The world didn't know how to process that, because it wasn't a slogan, it was truth spoken in poetry. Behind closed doors, Western analysts wrote frantic memos. If Africa can act independently in defense, what stops it from acting independently in economics? And so, while the people of the Sahel danced in the streets, the corridors of power trembled in silence. Because Tindiban was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror, showing the world what it had refused to see for centuries. That Africa was never weak. It was simply uninterrupted. By the third dawn after Tindiban, the dust had settled on the battlefield, but not in the world's conscience. In every capital from Abuja to Algiers, analysts stared at their screens in disbelief. The impossible had happened, and it had happened without a single foreign flag on African soil. Western media called it a shocking display of coordination. French outlets whispered of a military mystery. But within Africa, no one spoke of mystery. They spoke of memory. A memory of kingdoms that once ruled from the Sahara to the sea, of warriors who defended their land long before the world discovered gunpowder. In cafes from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people didn't discuss geopolitics. They shared pride like fire. Taxi drivers played Traore's speech on loop through crackling radios. Students painted AES logos on their backpacks. Musicians sampled the sound of SR-5 rocket launches into songs of liberation. The rhythm of sovereignty had returned, and yet behind the celebration, a quiet tension built. Because victory is not an ending, it's an invitation to destiny. In Ouagadougou, Traore gathered his commanders under the shade of a half-finished hangar. There was no ceremony, only maps, sand, and silence. He spoke not as a man basking in glory, but as one carrying the weight of the future. "If we can share blood," he said, "we can share bread." Those words were simple, but they cracked open history. Within weeks, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso formalized what the world would soon call the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a pact not written in foreign capitals, but under the blinding sun of N'Djamena. Its cornerstone was clear: shared defense, shared intelligence, shared destiny. This was not symbolism, it was structure. For the first time in modern Africa, 3 sovereign governments bound themselves to one security charter. Not under a United Nations resolution, not under NATO oversight, but under the principle that African soil protects African souls. The shift was seismic. Old embassies went quiet. Western diplomats were recalled for consultations. The same headlines that once ignored the Sahel now screamed of a rise in African militarism. But to the people who lived there, it was not militarism, it was liberation. In Mali, instructors rewrote training manuals, replacing foreign acronyms with Traore's 3 doctrines: intelligence, mobility, unity. In Niger, engineers worked late into the night, building prototypes of homemade drones using salvaged parts from captured enemy tech. And in Burkina Faso, the military academy of Ouagadougou replaced colonial history textbooks with the doctrine of self-defense. The transformation was not just physical, it was psychological. For generations, African soldiers had been told they were auxiliaries in someone else's mission. Now they were authors of their own. Meanwhile, across oceans, confusion gave way to unease. In Washington, think tank analysts debated whether the Sahel was pivoting east. In Brussels, aides drafted statements urging dialogue and restraint. In Paris, the silence was thunderous. The empire that once dictated African affairs suddenly found itself outside the conversation. But across the global south, in Caracas, in Hanoi, in New Delhi, the mood was electric. Editorials hailed Tindiban as proof that the post-colonial world could rise without permission. One Egyptian headline captured it perfectly: "The West trains soldiers, Africa creates warriors." Back in Burkina Faso, the energy turned inward. Markets reopened. Roads once patrolled by gunmen, now filled with farmers returning to their fields. Convoys carried medicine instead of fear. Refugees crossed back over borders they once fled. And for the first time in years, the sound that ruled the Sahel was not gunfire, but laughter. In one village near the former front, An old man told a reporter, "The lion has remembered his strength, but the hunters will not forget him easily." Those words drifted across radios and timelines, a poetic warning carved into the collective mind. Every victory bursts vigilance. Across the Atlantic, television hosts in America replayed footage of AES soldiers standing beneath the orange Sahel sun. For veterans who had once served on African soil, the images stirred something unexpected: respect. They knew what it meant to stand your ground when the world doubted you. One retired Marine wrote online, "They did it. They actually did it without us." It wasn't mockery, it was admiration, raw and reluctant. But admiration in the West quickly turned to anxiety, because if Africa could fight for itself, it could soon think for itself. And that, more than any rocket or drone, was the true revolution. Across the Atlantic, the morning news in Washington, Paris, and London opened with disbelief. The headlines looked surreal. "Africa wins its own war." "The Sahel shock." Anchors stumbled through the words as if pronouncing a forbidden truth. For decades, the Sahel had been a synonym for failure. Now it was rewriting the dictionary. In think tanks and war rooms, the questions came fast and frantic. How did three sanctioned nations coordinate an operation with such surgical precision? Where did the drones come from? Who provided the tech grid? Surely there had to be a hidden hand, a shadow benefactor. But the truth was harder to accept than any conspiracy. Africa had acted alone, and that reality terrified those who had built entire policies on the assumption that it couldn't. For over half a century, Western foreign policy in Africa had never been about solving instability, only managing it. A self-reliant Africa didn't fit the model. There was no profit in sovereignty. In Paris, ministers spoke of reassessing partnerships. In Brussels, diplomats called for urgent dialogue. At the UN, spokespeople praised regional initiative. Their smiles too stiff, their applause too slow. Even in Washington, officials who once dismissed the AES as symbolic now demanded classified briefings. Behind closed doors, fear smelled like coffee and exhaustion, because if Africa could defend itself today, it could define itself tomorrow. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was simpler and far more powerful. There were no panels, no press releases, only celebration. Young men painted their faces in red and gold and marched barefoot through the capital chanting, "We rise, we rise, we rise again." In those words, you could hear 1,000 years of silence breaking. Meanwhile, artists and poets gave the moment shape. Murals of Traore appeared on concrete walls, not as a general, but as a teacher holding a book and a rifle, symbols of knowledge and defense side by side. Musicians in Lagos and Johannesburg wrote songs called "The Doctrine of Dust," their choruses echoing through the continent. "Where bombs once fell, now we build. Where others ruled, now we decide." The resonance was cultural as much as political. African filmmakers announced documentaries titled Tindiban, The Day We Remembered. Philosophers began speaking of the Sahelian consciousness, a new way of seeing freedom, not as a gift, but as a muscle. But in Western boardrooms, the tone was different. Reports spoke of a potential power vacuum. Analysts warned that the collapse of dependency structures could threaten energy routes and resource contracts. Translation: Africa's independence was bad for business. One internal memo leaked from a European intelligence unit read, "If this ideological momentum continues, the traditional framework of influence will disintegrate within a decade." But outside the walls of fear, something unstoppable was already taking shape. Traore, ever composed, spoke to young officers in Ouagadougou. No flags, no ceremony. Just the wind carrying his voice across a courtyard, still smelling of dust and diesel. "The next war," he said, "will not be fought with guns. It will be fought against doubt, division, and dependency." That sentence traveled farther than any missile, because everyone understood the real battlefield had shifted from the desert to the mind. And so, while the West debated, Africa began to build. AES announced a multi-year reconstruction plan to convert former war zones into trade corridors, to replace bunkers with schools, to turn the fields of blood into fields of grain. The symbolism was deliberate. Where once soldiers had stood guard, children would walk to class. And when reporters asked Traoré if this was idealism, he smiled. Idealism is the first step toward independence. Meanwhile, the ripples reached the global south. In Caracas, murals of the Sahelian soldiers appeared beside portraits of Bolivar. In Hanoi, editorials compared Tindiban to Dien Bien Phu, the battle that ended colonial illusions in Asia. And in Addis Ababa, a panel of economists proposed something bold: an African digital gold reserve, inspired by the AES's Unified Command Network. They called it the Sahel Standard. It was no longer just about defense. It was about direction. Africa deciding what tomorrow should look like. But as the world watched in awe and unease, one truth lingered beneath every headline. The old order was cracking, and from those cracks, something radiant was emerging. Africa was not asking for a seat at the table. It was building its own. And for the first time in centuries, the rest of the world was the one watching, trying to understand how the narrative had slipped from its hands and landed in the desert wind of Tindiban. When the last echoes of gunfire faded into the Sahel wind, a new sound began to rise. The steady rhythm of hammers on stone, shovels on earth, voices in motion. It wasn't the rhythm of reconstruction. It was the rhythm of resurrection. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, people spoke of the doctrine of dust. The idea that from destruction, something sacred could be built. That sovereignty was not just defended. It was crafted grain by grain by the hands of those who refused to kneel. In the northern provinces, former battlefields turned into workshops. Where soldiers once hid behind sandbags, children now drew maps of their own country on school chalkboards. The same trucks that once carried rockets now carried books. And at dawn, under the same sky that once burned with fire, the Sahel's farmers returned to their land. Where bombs once fell, we will plant, Traore said. Where our sons died, our daughters will study. That became the creed of a generation. In Ouagadougou, the AES command transformed its war rooms into data centers, not for military surveillance, but for agricultural logistics. Screens that once tracked drone coordinates now tracked rainfall, seed distribution, and trade routes. The code that guided missiles now guided tractors. In Niamey, Niger's engineers developed solar irrigation systems inspired by battlefield drone batteries. In Mali, the same reconnaissance algorithms used during the Tindiban offensive were repurposed to map underground aquifers, turning intelligence into nourishment. This was not coincidence, it was intention. For the first time in post-colonial Africa, war technology was not left to rust or sold abroad. It was reimagined as a tool for survival. Traoré called it the transformation of defense into creation. His speeches during this time were short, almost whispered, but they carried a weight that silenced every room. Freedom, he said, is not the absence of chains. It is the presence of choice. And the people understood. They began to see sovereignty not as a flag or an anthem, but as the ability to decide where their bread came from, where their gold went, where their children learned. In the capital, a group of Sahelian artists painted a mural that soon went viral. It showed a cracked desert hand rising from the earth, holding a sprouting tree that glowed like molten gold. Across it were 3 words in bold script: intelligence, mobility, unity. Traoré's doctrine had left the battlefield. It had become a philosophy. Even outside the Sahel, the ripple spread. In Kinshasa, youth formed study groups called the Traoré Circles, discussing leadership, discipline, and the moral use of power. In Dar es Salaam, university students staged a play titled The Lion Who Remembered, retelling the story of Tindiban through poetry and drum beats. In Dakar, musicians composed symphonies blending African percussion with orchestral violins. Each movement named after the stages of the Sahelian campaign. The world was listening. But not everyone celebrated. In old colonial capitals, unease hardened into strategy. Media narratives began to shift, from admiration to accusation, from curiosity to containment. Editorials warned of authoritarian drift, of militarized nationalism, of dangerous self-determination. Yet every attempt to twist the story only fueled the fire. Because for millions across the continent, Tindiban was not a political headline. It was a psychological awakening. The old dependency myths were cracking. For generations, Africans had been told they were too poor to build, too divided to unite, too unstable to lead. But the AES had proven the opposite, that poverty is not destiny and unity is not a miracle. It is a decision. In the courtyards of villages and the corridors of universities, a single phrase began to echo like a prayer and a promise. We are enough. 4 words that no longer asked permission. They declared existence. And as the Sahel rebuilt from the dust, those words became the foundation of a new identity, one not built on what Africa had lost, but on what it had finally remembered. For a brief moment, the Sahel breathed freely. Markets reopened, families returned. The sound of drums replaced the echo of gunfire. But history, as always, has a way of testing conviction. The world that had ignored Africa in defeat suddenly turned its full attention to Africa in victory. And attention in geopolitics is rarely innocent. The first counterattacks came not from the desert, but from the airwaves. Foreign media flooded screens with familiar rhetoric, words like authoritarianism, militarism, instability. They did not mention the schools being rebuilt or the wells being restored, only the fear of an Africa that no longer asked for permission. In Paris, think tanks hosted emergency panels titled "The Sahel Problem Reborn." In Washington, headlines questioned whether rogue nationalism was spreading across West Africa. They called the AES radical. They called Traore unpredictable. But beneath the labels lay something simpler: panic. Because for the first time in modern history, the center of gravity was shifting southward. And those who once gave orders now had to listen. Then came the sanctions, quiet but deliberate. Aid packages delayed, development loans under review, partnerships temporarily suspended. The goal was clear: starve the dream before it could stabilize. But what the world forgot was that the Sahel had already learned to live without permission. In Ouagadougou, when the first embargo on spare parts arrived, engineers began dismantling old machines, repurposing components from abandoned Western vehicles. When certain foreign banks froze transactions, local cooperatives switched to barter networks and regional credit systems. And when global media refused to broadcast AES victories, a new kind of journalism was born: raw, African, decentralized. Independent reporters armed with cameras, solar batteries, and conviction began documenting every new school, every restored bridge, every returning farmer. They called themselves Voices of the Red Dust. Within months, their footage reached millions online. And through them, the world saw what the embargo couldn't hide: that the Sahel wasn't shrinking under pressure, it was hardening. Still, the countercurrent grew. Cyber disinformation campaigns appeared, painting AES unity as the work of foreign manipulation. Anonymous sources whispered of secret alliances, hidden donors, external interference. But the truth, once again, was local. What fueled the Sahel was not foreign gold. It was memory and discipline. General Traoré addressed the nation during this period of tension. His uniform was simple, his tone composed. He stood before a crowd of workers, not soldiers. "They call us radical," he said, "but it is not radical to build what you were told to destroy. It is not rebellion to stand on your own feet. It is only new to those who never thought we could." Those words spread faster than the sanctions. Across the continent, movements began forming, small at first, then swelling with momentum. In Senegal, the young builders of the Sahel launched community farming programs inspired by AES resource management. In Cameroon, students designed drone prototypes for environmental mapping, quoting Traoré's principle of intelligence repurposed. In South Africa, talk shows debated whether the Sahel model could become the foundation of a new Pan-African economy. The countercurrent was no longer one-sided. Each act of pressure from abroad was met with a pulse of innovation within. And yet, not everyone watching understood the gravity of what was unfolding. For the first time in centuries, Africa was no longer reacting to global systems. It was creating them. Economists began calling it the Sahel effect, a phenomenon where adversity accelerated autonomy. The tighter the constraints, the faster the adaptation. In Washington, one analyst admitted on air, they were supposed to collapse. Instead, they're evolving faster than we can predict. That was not fear speaking. That was recognition. And in the quiet corners of the continent, elders smiled knowingly. They had seen this pattern before. When empires overreached, when outsiders underestimated, when the earth itself decided to reclaim what was buried. The lion does not roar for applause, said an old Fulani proverb. He roars to remind the forest that he is awake. The Sahel was awake now, and no amount of noise from the outside could drown that sound. The storm of resistance gave birth to something unexpected: order. Not the kind imposed from abroad, but the kind forged in silence and necessity. Across the Sahel, the three nations that once shared only pain now shared purpose. The AES transformed from a defense pact into an economic alliance. Burkina Faso offered gold, Mali offered agriculture, Niger offered energy. Together, they formed the backbone of what Traore called the Circle of Autonomy. Trade routes reopened under Sahelian flags. For the first time, trucks carried goods stamped "Made in the Sahel." Markets that once traded in foreign currencies began experimenting with a new digital tender, a pilot system backed not by debt, but by gold. Outside Africa, the tremor was felt immediately. Old investors withdrew, but new partners arrived, from Brazil, India, and the Emirates, nations that understood what it meant to rise after being underestimated. In Geneva and Paris, commentators mocked the experiment, calling it symbolic economics. But symbols once again proved stronger than systems, because every transaction made in the name of self-reliance was a declaration that colonial economics was over. At the core of it all stood Traore, calm, unshaken, more philosopher than general now. "We are not chasing wealth," he said. "We are reclaiming meaning." That became the foundation of the Sahel reordering, an awakening that would no longer measure success by Western indexes, but by how many hands could plant, build, and feed without permission. And as the sun sank behind the dunes, a quiet truth emerged. The world had maps, but Africa was now drawing its own. By mid-2026, whispers turned into revelation. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, from Bamako to Conakry, the same rumor spread like desert fire. The Sahel was about to announce something that would change everything. For weeks, speculation filled the air. Was it a new currency? A defense pact? A declaration of total independence? But when the day finally came, the truth was far greater. At sunrise in a vast open plain outside Ouagadougou, thousands gathered beneath the orange sky. Soldiers stood beside farmers, miners beside students, women beside generals. A long table of microphones waited beneath a single banner that read, "From Gold to Glory." General Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, not in parade uniform, but in the same worn fatigues he had worn in Tindiban. Behind him stood the leaders of Mali and Niger. There were no teleprompters, no script, only conviction. "For centuries," he began, "our gold has built empires that were not ours. Our hands dug, but others filled their vaults. Today, that era ends. From this day forward, every ounce of Sahelian gold will serve African development, our schools, our roads, our children's dreams." Then came the revelation, the digital gold reserve of the Sahel, a blockchain-based monetary network fully controlled by the AES. Its value backed not by Western approval, but by the real gold beneath Sahelian soil. Its first token, AFG, Africa's future gold. The announcement sent tremors through global markets. Stock tickers in London flickered red. Currency analysts scrambled for statements. The IMF issued a warning. But across Africa, celebrations erupted. Crowds chanted in the streets, "Our gold, our code, our future." It was more than economics. It was metaphysical. The transformation of pain into power, dependency into design. Tindiban had given Africa military sovereignty. Now AFG gave it financial soul. As the sun reached its zenith, Traoré raised his hand to the crowd and declared, "We are no longer the suppliers of the world's wealth. We are the architects of our own." The cheers rolled across the plains like thunder, and for the first time since the colonial dawn, the balance of power tilted south. The night after the announcement, the desert was quiet again. But this time, it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that comes when history exhales. When a people realize they have stepped beyond the edge of what was once thought possible, the fires of celebration burned across the Sahel. In every village square, elders told their grandchildren what had happened that morning, not as news but as prophecy fulfilled. In every home the same sentence was spoken, softly, reverently: Africa has remembered itself. Foreign commentators called it radical idealism. But for the people of the Sahel, it was not ideology, it was identity. Because for once, freedom had not come with a treaty or a signature. It had come with choice. Schools began teaching the Tindiban principle, a lesson that sovereignty is not inherited, it is rebuilt daily. Universities introduced new courses on strategic self-reliance. Young Africans began studying not how to leave their continent, but how to transform it. The ripple traveled far beyond Africa. In Latin America, in South Asia, in the Middle East, activists cited the Sahel as proof that the post-colonial world could rise without permission. A journalist in Buenos Aires wrote, "When Africa stood up, the earth itself seemed to tilt." But amid the global noise, Traore remained grounded. He rejected interviews, refused foreign awards. Instead, he traveled across the countryside, meeting farmers, visiting schools, sitting with children in classrooms built from the very bricks funded by Sahelian gold. One reporter who managed to speak with him asked, "General, what does victory mean to you?" He smiled faintly, gazing at the horizon. "Victory," he said, "is when a mother no longer fears the sound of planes above her village, when a soldier no longer needs to die for a flag, but lives for his people." Those words became his legacy. They spread not through speeches, but through whispers, carried by traders, by teachers, by the wind itself. Months later, a new mural appeared in Ouagadougou. It showed the outline of the African continent, glowing like a rising sun, and beneath it, the inscription in bold letters: "We are not rising to impress the world. We are rising because no one else will do it for us." The painting went viral, a symbol, a signature, a promise. As dawn broke over the Sahel, a flock of cranes lifted from the Niger River, their wings catching the first light. And in that quiet beauty, something profound became clear. Tindiban had not been a battle. It was a beginning, the beginning of a century where Africa would no longer be defined by tragedy, but by transformation. And as the sun rose higher, the horizon shimmered, not with mirage, but with certainty. Africa was awake. And this time, it would not go back to sleep.